Kate, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed. Got a few questions. Perhaps you could start by telling us a bit about your area and its relationship to applied linguistics.
So in my keynote, which I'm going to give tomorrow, I talk about how I started by doing an MA in Literacies and Education with Gunter Kress in the mid-90s. So I guess I started actually in adult literacy, and then Gunter was very into multimodality. And then I went on to do a PhD in literacy supervised by Brian Street, which was very much an anthropological perspective on literacy. And I suppose I'm still really interested in everyday literacies, in everyday literacy and language practices, in community understandings of literacy, and in young people's understandings of what communicational practices are. And I think my keynote is really going to try and blur, mess up, possibly destroy bits of applied linguistics that tidy up language. I think it's trying to say, hang on, if we're in the real world and we're with people, people's understanding of language matters, particularly young people's, and their perceptions of what language and literacy are actually really important. That us as experts, I'm kind of de-expertifying applied linguistics into a kind of mush of stuff that could be jumping, hooping, crying, clanging. These things all matter to me. So it's making applied linguistics messy is one of my main aims of my talk.
Well, that sounds very interesting. Well, would you say that your views of literacy have changed a lot over the years you've been working at?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really shifted is that I spent 10 years working in Rotherham, and the last 5 years we were doing a collaborative ethnographic study with community researchers, including someone called Zainab Rasool and a number of different people who lived different literacy practices differently from applied linguistics. Applied linguistics is lovely, but it does have this need to kind of classify from particular perspectives, and it was Zainab and colleagues who helped me see that intergenerational knowledge, hidden knowledge, ways of knowing and perceiving things were often inflected differently within communities, and that community understanding of language and literacy really, the notion of expert is quite problematic. It's also quite white, and it's also quite Western, and so I've really kind of looked at decolonising applied linguistics in my work and thought about community understandings of literacy and language through the eyes of my research participants as co-researchers. So that's what shifted, and I have written about that in a book with Mike Grenfell.
Oh, right,
yes.
Good. And tell us a bit more about other communities you might have worked with.
So at the moment I'm working with 60 year fours in a school in Levensholm in Manchester who are coming to a conference, the BAAL conference, to present their work, which are films about feeling odd in the world of education. And one of the things they're really interesting about is how moving between languages, being in multilingual households, is actually really odd. If your mother speaks Arabic and your father speaks Urdu, and you are supposed to speak English, but your best friend speaks Pashto, and your other best friend speaks Punjabi, and neither of you can write those languages, but you can speak them, that's pretty odd, but it's very under-documented. So one of the things about children's literacy and language practices is they're emergent, and they're not what we know, they're what we don't know. It's about the not yet, I think.
So will you follow those children through into secondary school, do you think?
I'd quite like to. In fact, I was just planning a project with the Science and Industry Museum looking at hidden skills within South Asian communities in Manchester, and we might ask to do that. I'm one of those scary people that doesn't actually sit in one discipline very much. I hop, and the reason I hop is I follow where the people are. So with the kids, I follow where they are. So it's multilingualism one day, and the next day it's trampolines. I've got loads of trampoline data. So it's almost like where do you go is not defined by the discipline, but by the young people.
Yes. What do you see as future directions for your area of research?
I think we're going to be really challenged by what applied linguistics is and what it can do. I think what I talk about a lot is the move from these words like code switching and indexicality and metapragmatics to translanguaging, which I think is a really good thing, because I think the more messy and the more messed up the discipline gets by everyday perceptions, the better. I think Parkin talks about rethinking language ontologies, and Pennycook talks about languages in common. And I think there's something about changing understandings through the eyes of. I think we're going to have to end up finding new ways of doing research, which are much more in tandem with people's everyday lives. What I don't like is all that separation from academics from the world. I find that very problematic. I think it's caused a lot of problems in the world.
So what advice would you give to early career researchers starting out in your area now?
I think if you can be brave enough to have moments when you give up your discipline. I know that's really hard, but that's how I've learned. And also have moments when you cross disciplines and you don't know what's happening. It's really hard to feel unknown things. And that's a book I'm about to write, is about unlearning and the unknown. And things like failure and no are really important. And things like when you're doing an ethics review, you're often encouraged to get people to say yes. I think encouraging people to say no, young people, is really good. So all the things that you're taught, I do think at one level is really important. You actually look at the underbelly. So my advice is not to be scared of failing, not to be scared of messing up, not to be scared of changing your mind. There we are.
Anything you'd like to add?
My keynote's a little bit provocative, because what I do try and do is most of my citations are of women. And this is because when one of my students went to a linguistics conference in Finland once, she came back very disheartened and she said all the keynotes were men. That's not the case here today and at this conference, but I do try and redress a bit of that balance, because for years I felt like an outsider at BAAL, partly because I did multimodality, materialism, new materialism. I've always done the outsider things, but I think that the conference itself is very inclusive and I really love it. So I want to say simultaneously, yeah, I'm being a bit critical of some things about the world of sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, but in another sense, I think it's a great space. I think it's a space for diversity. It's a very enthusiastic space and it's buzzing today, so I'm really enjoying it.